Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Commander Experience podcast. I'm one of your hosts, I'm Brian,
And I'm Jacob.
and this is the continuation of our Graveyard series. In earlier episodes, we covered the pros and cons of running a Graveyard deck. We talked a little bit about card drawing and self-mill, and we also talked about what cards we do and do not run in our Graveyard decks. In this episode, we're going to break down what the very definition of a Graveyard deck is.
We're going to talk about what strategies and commanders you might run, also go into some engines and payoffs, and finally talk about how to protect your graveyard and if you even want to do that.
Let's break it down. So, as we did in the early episode, a quick disclaimer. This series or podcast in general is from a Bracket Force perspective. We are not here to talk you out of not playing any of your favorite cards. By all means, keep playing them. We are just here to give you our take on what we think a graveyard deck is and what cards to run and what defines a graveyard deck. So take everything with a grain of salt and keep that in mind. So Jacob, I think a nice place to start this episode is talking a little bit about if the commander itself has any impact regarding if it being a graveyard deck or not. I mean, do you need to have a Muldrotha or something like that in your command zone in order to call it a graveyard deck? What do you think about that?
I think there is like the easy choice is of course taking some of the commanders that actually says graveyard and use those, but I think there is plenty of commanders that doesn't mention the graveyard specifically, that just does the graveyard thing well in different ways. So it could be commander that discards or want you to discard, or some other way of interacting with putting cards into the graveyard. But yeah, it is of course easier to build ones that specifically mention the graveyard.
I'm also thinking that it kind of depends, because as we're going to talk a little bit more about in depth, is if the commander itself is a payoff, an engine, or what role does the commander have? Because in the case of the commander being a payoff, you usually don't play it until the very end or until you're trying to win. So by that definition, might as well just be another card in the 99 that you tutored for or something like that.
Yeah, one of the things that comes on top of my mind is Breya doesn't really mention the graveyard, but that they kind of have a tendency to use the graveyard as well, because the graveyard is kind of an easy way sometimes to make infinite mana and then win with Breya, even though Breya doesn't have anything to do with the graveyard specifically.
Yeah, and Breya, of course, also have the advantage of playing 4 colors. Yeah. So she gets access to it all.
I also think that the strategy you're trying to run from your graveyard has some impact on if your commander necessarily needs to have anything to do with the graveyard. Like some of the strategies like Reanimator don't necessarily care that much about which commander you have, as long as you can put one specific card in your graveyard and you can reanimate that one specific card. Your plane is kind of live, and then your commander can technically do something else.
Yeah, and you also see one of the OG graveyard commanders, Sir Conrad, where you don't even play anything out of the graveyard. You care more about what is going in the graveyard and maybe even leave the graveyard by exile to trigger your commander. So there's a lot of different values to be getting from your commander, where I think most people associated with having some sort of value being played from the graveyard, that being a Muldrotha or an Emery. Or
that being said, I think that we specifically, both you and I, lean more towards the commander that actually mention the graveyard. So I think it also has something to do with the person building the deck, what they like to do.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be an episode without me mentioning Muldrotha, but that is the deck that taught me the most about graveyards, and for many, many years and many, many games, I considered Muldrotha to be a value commander. And maybe it was, I'm not really sure, because the banning of Jeweled Lotus, of course, changed a lot. My deck was a lot more explosive back then, and by that extent, maybe it was possible to play it as a value deck. I'm not saying it isn't possible at all. I'm just saying that's not my route anymore. I'm considering Muldrotha to be a payoff now, and I play it that way, meaning that Muldrotha does not come out until I'm trying to win. And that also means that I don't self-mill that heavy anymore. I only kind of do it to set up the graveyard with lands because I play Aftermath Analyst and Lumra. So and they can enable me to have so much mana that playing Muldrotha on the very next turn is usually where I'm going to try and win the game if I have one of those, getting all my lands back into play.
Talking about that, we can get into one of the first strategies that we want to talk about, and that is the one Muldrotha is using. We here have called it self-mill, but I think there's like different versions of self-mill, so we can also get into that. But as you said, your Muldrotha deck is trying to not so much abuse the graveyard during the early game, but more abuse it late game, and for the most part, actually just be so explosive that then it just instantly wins the game. So that's like one end of the spectrum, and the other end, which also is a self-mill strategy that I think that you also use in some of your decks. We have talked about Emry before, and that deck also have the explosive thing at the end, but she is also using the graveyard early on to get to that explosive end. So that's also like two different ways of doing it, and I think newer commanders like Emry is more, power creep, so it can do both. And a card like Muldrotha is only good at doing one of the things.
Yeah,
I will say that it is probably possible to have a value version of Muldrotha, but I think it's hard in Bracket 4 at this point because it's 6 mana.
Yeah, and I myself has not been able to afford a Grim Monolith yet, and I do think that is one of the cards you need in Muldrotha in order to maybe playing it more aggressively. Of course, you want to be putting Dark Ritual and those sort of rituals into the deck. I am already running Mana Vault, but I do agree that Emry kind of does both things because she's using the graveyard for value while she's looking for the combo pieces. But that is a thing Muldrotha does not do when you compare it to Emry.
Yeah, and saying it doesn't do it at all is kind of like a disservice because you still do Aftermath Analysts, get 4 lands into play kind of early on, so it still uses the graveyard as a resource, but it's not like the only focus plan as Emry is doing, where every card is basically good from the graveyard and you want to repeat it, and repeating it is what a graveyard they get good for. I think that like the two ends of the spectrum.
But there's also, of course, the Reanimator strategy, and you're kind of running a couple of decks in that category. I think you both have Tyam and Carador, and they play very differently, of course. But I don't think, even though that Tyam is by some extent a popular graveyard commander, plays very differently than you see other graveyard commanders, I think. Because it is Reanimator strategy, but it's sort of more low to the ground than what you expect for reanimation. You usually expect these big creatures where you just play some more low to the ground value creatures and keep playing them over and over again. Stacks pieces like Draneth Magistrate and Archon of Emirian and creatures like that.
Yeah, that's a good way to explain. Like, Time is trying to put a lot of small pieces into play that interact with everyone, and like the typical thing that people think about when they hear Reanimator is probably casting Reanimate on a 10 mana creature that has a big impact of the game and will swing the game in a specific direction early on. So that's also like two ends of the spectrum on that one. And I think that Reanimator specifically, and we said that earlier as well, doesn't necessarily have to be very graveyard focused. Time specifically is because the deck is, or the commander is talking about the graveyard. But you could just want to have a specific big mana creature in play that draws cards or whatever you wanted to do, and is a hole early on or something.
But what about Carador? You don't play Carador that much. You're using the Shifting Woodlands Squandered Resources combo for that deck, as I remember.
Yeah, like the Dream of Carador, and it hasn't really worked out that well. That's probably what I'm playing. Is I wanted basically to lock the game down so no one can play, and then use the Squandered Resources combo because not a lot of stacks pieces interact with that combo because it's just abilities.
Yeah.
But in general, Tyam does it better. So
it is also a fun commander to be choosing for that kind of strategy because, okay, I guess Aftermath Analyst is a creature, but you kind of want to be putting creatures into your graveyard with Carador. So it's a bit of an odd win count you have in that deck.
It is a bit odd one. I think it was one of the examples where I wanted a specific win con and just chose a commander afterward that kind of fit the bill. Hadn't really worked out. But what would you say, like a Reanimator deck versus the self-mill? What puts them apart? Is there a specific, is it the way you win or how you get there? Or?
I think it's both, to be honest. And I do think that tempo is a big part of it because I do think that a Reanimator strategy is by far much slower because either you're casting something like Rise of the Dark Realms, which we don't exactly see in our part, or you I mean, it's usually 2 to 3 creatures you need in order to do a combo win with creatures, and if you need that, you're usually playing something like Protein Hulk, and don't really need the graveyard. You just tutor that into play most of the time.
I have kind of the same feeling that Reanimator, in our pod at least, is more your deck is built around having one very expensive card in play, and you're using the Reanimator strategy to try and doing that early, and it doesn't really have that much to do with the graveyard in general, other than that.
Yeah, and I think that your Time deck is really the only successful Reanimator deck in our part, I think. And there's a bit of irony in that, I think, because it's not the reanimation of the creatures that is winning you the game. That's sort of just buying you time for you to get all your pieces in place. Either that being Granite Magistrate that gets removed, that you get back into play, or Opposition Agent, or whatever you're using. So it's not so much as reanimation strategy. It doesn't play like a typical reanimation strategy, I think. So, but I guess it is in many ways.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, but I see what you mean. It doesn't really do that, and that's also, if we talk about Reanimator decks, don't most of the time actually use a lot of the cards that a graveyard deck uses to win. Like when I think about what we talked about before, self-mill and all that, in my brain, the cards I'm hearing in my head, okay, we want to play Hermit Druid and we want to play Breach, if that's the kind of decks you want to play. Maybe LED combos with Bomberman, those kind of cards, because you have a lot of cards in your graveyard that you can use, but the Reanimator deck is probably just winning with some other kind of combo, not necessarily anything to do with the graveyard.
And also, of course, a big difference is that Time does reanimate more than just creatures. And that's a big upside, because you can get Earthcraft or other important pieces back into play. I know one of your Wincons in that deck is a land. So getting that back from the graveyard is, of course, a tool that you don't usually see in reanimation strategies.
The Wincon seems to be, in Reanimator, not necessarily anything to do with the graveyard, where in the Stealth Mill, it's most of the time classic Wincons from the graveyard.
Yeah. One of our other categories of graveyard decks you see is the one we call value over time, using the graveyard as a resource. And I do think that Time kind of falls into both categories when talking about that. It's both a Reanimator deck by some extent, but it's the very definition of value over time, because he needs so many pieces and you need counters and all that stuff. So you're really playing all the pieces you need to buy that time, like we talked about earlier with the stacks pieces.
Yeah, and the decks where you want the value of time. We talked about Emery as well doing that. I think those kind of decks, it's opposite to reanimation things. Most of the time they run a lot of cheap things, because graveyards are good at recasting the same things on repeat. So I think those are the decks that, if you want to say this is a real graveyard deck, I think that's the kind of decks that you need to point at, because they are the ones that cast multiple spells from the graveyard and keep repeating it. And they're also the decks that have the hardest time of running into graveyard hate compared to the two other, because they kind of have to use the graveyard through the whole game, where the two other strategies kind of have like this one moment in the game where they want it, and then for the rest of the game it doesn't really matter. They just want it when they combo off or when they need to reanimate the big splashy creature.
One of the value over time graveyard as a resource deck I built myself recently is Corum the Undertaker, and that is also one of those decks where you're kind of building momentum over the whole game. It's way more explosive than Moldrotha and Emery when it first gets going. Usually creating a lot of both card draw and mana, but it is in many ways using the graveyard as a resource, because when he attacks, he mills one card from each player, and by that extent pseudo drawing 4 cards. So that is very much using not only my own graveyard but all of our graveyards for value, and I think that falls into that category as well.
Yeah, definitely. And he's also interesting because compared to a lot of the other commanders, he doesn't really care that much what went into the graveyard early in the game. Of course, you're probably going to play some cards that can reanimate, because you have a tendency to put cards in your graveyard, but yeah, he wants to see what happened this turn. So in some ways, he is like less susceptible to some graveyard hate. So
Yeah, and I also think that he plays so much better than my Muldrotha deck, and that hurts me to say because I love my Muldrotha deck, but he's filling my graveyards. He's 2 less mana, and also he doesn't have the disadvantage of being a big threat because of the cards I have in graveyard, because you guys know that I can't play those cards with Corum like I can with Muldrotha, only on the turn that I'm actually in. So when I pass the turn, you kind of have it in your mind that these cards are no longer a problem, but they are.
Yeah.
But they don't seem like as big as a problem as the Displacer Kitten does in Muldrotha, even though Muldrotha is not in play. So he's kind of flying a bit under the radar, I think, and he plays differently. And I feel I only have had a few games with him. I think I have 12 games with him so far. And it just feels like I get a little more elbow room to play him, which I think is a bit weird because I actually think he, in many ways, I'm more dangerous.
Yeah, I think it's because that, as we had talked before, that Muldrotha is just kind of so obvious. It's when you know the deck well that your opponent playing, you have a tendency to just look at the graveyard and say, oh, these 2 cards is in the graveyard. That means he wins if you place your commander. So it feels like you're always very close to winning, where Corum and to some extent Green Goblin, which we're going to talk about in a second, it feels a little bit more random because you don't really know what's going to get in the graveyard, so it's kind of hard to fear what's going to happen. And of course you're going to learn the more you play against the deck, but it's not as obvious because it's not written on the wall before you try to go off. So yeah. I think that's one of the big differences.
I agree. And yeah, as you mentioned, Green Goblin, a newer deck of mine, is definitely here and now. Like Corum, it's the turn you discard to the graveyard. So it's very much a graveyard deck, but it almost don't feel like a graveyard deck because you're discarding them and can play them in the turn you're discarding them. It plays a bit weird, but I would say it is very much a graveyard deck. It's very explosive as well. You can win out of nothing. You can also whiff in that deck. There's no real combo in that deck. Of course, in the end, I can win with the Lab Man effect or Thassa's Oracle or something like that. But it is kind of just drawing your whole deck in one turn, or you're trying to at least.
I guess it's technically a self-mill deck, but it almost more falls into the category of a Storm deck, I would say.
Yeah, that's the feeling I get, to be honest.
Yeah. But I also say that the 2 last commanders we talked about, Corum and Green Goblin especially, I think is also like an effect of just newer cards being better straight up. It's kind of insane that I remember Muldrotha when it came out, everyone was scared and it was crazy card. And these 2 new guys is just, they're not only the payoff, they're also the value engine, also giving you cost reduction and
yeah,
and this and that, and just, yeah.
It's kind of like, I know it's not a graveyard deck, but it's kind of like Helga, which I don't think is that powerful of commander. But when you get a commander that costs 3 mana, that both draws you cards, provides the mana, and giving you life, it's just like...
Yeah.
I'm surprised it doesn't also have a Underworld Breach or something like that attached to it.
Exactly.
And you also see now commanders that are just Bolas' Citadel in the command zone, so we're not far from it.
Yeah, true.
But talking about graveyards, maybe we should just real quick talk a bit about some of the classic engines, payoffs we see playing across them, and maybe talk a bit about some of the cards we play ourselves. So will you go first?
Yes, just talk about Green Goblin. So easy card to mention that we always talk about is Breach, so Underworld Breach. And what you can say Underworld Breach without saying Brain Freeze. So that's a quick 1-2 combo right there out of the gates. And Breach also, besides being a good combo, it's also just a good card that if you incidentally mill yourself, drawing a Breach is probably good, even though it doesn't win you the game.
In Green Goblin, I actually don't play Brain Freeze. I don't play that in any of my Breach deck because I don't like to use that combo. But also Brain Freeze is milling in that deck, and I want to be discarding, so I don't want to mill a whole lot of cards that I don't then have access to. So I think that Green Goblin is one of the first decks where I actually just play Underworld Breach for value, to just replay some of the cards I've already played. That's a bit weird, but it also just showcases how strong Underworld Breach is, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I have a tendency to just, if I don't play green, I have a tendency to just play Underworld Breach as a regrowth effect. So later on, even though my deck does nothing with the graveyard, just cast Breach and cast a spell from the graveyard.
Yeah. Also, cards we of course typical see with Underworld Breach is Jessica's Will and maybe Wheel of Fortune. A nice way to keep filling up the graveyard that you can use when you're using Underworld Breach's ability, where you have to pay for the cost and exiling cards. And also, Lion's Eye Diamond works perfectly with Underworld Breach, providing infinite mana. And that is also the card I use in my Muldrotha deck, along with Displacer Kitten, because playing Lion's Eye Diamond out of the graveyards with Displacer Kitten in play will blink Muldrotha, and I can just keep casting it over and over again. And of course, we have cards like Grinding Station. We have synergy cards like Mesmeric Orb and Basalt Monolith, where you can just infinite mill your whole graveyard. Well, what else do we have?
Then there is Safi, Eric's daughter, and that's one of the ones I play in my Ketis. Old school combo, basically. You can repeatedly take something back if it can get Safi back, and you can just have a loop that drains people if you have a drain effect or something like that. So that's a very old school one. And it also works just for protection, so that's why I like it. And it's easy to tutor because it's a creature.
Yeah.
And one of the newer ones, which is very powerful, we don't see it as much in our meta yet, is Abdel Adrian, with any enchantment that reanimates him, that just infinite blinks him and blinks everything, and you can win the game with that. And that's probably one of the strongest one, but I think the reason we don't see it as much is because it's white, and we don't have a lot of white reanimation decks in our pot.
But with all these engines and payoffs and self-milling and what have you, one good graveyard hate and it's all over, Jacob. So let's talk a little bit about graveyard protection. Are you running it? Is it worth it? Should you run it even if you're not? And I don't know, where do you stand on that topic?
The short answer, which is we're not gonna go into there, is I don't think it's worth running any protection. I don't, at least, but I know that you do, so I think you have a bit of a different take on it.
Well, I actually don't anymore, to be honest. Okay. I was running it, and for many years, especially Siren Storm Tamer. I played that in Muldrotha because it was serving two functions. It could both protect Muldrotha, but since it also says ability that targets myself as a player, it can counter a Bajuka Bog. So, and also some of the other graveyard hates. So I liked it for that reason. It was also a 1/1 flyer, so it could be an emergency blocker for just 1 mana. I still kind of like the card. I just think that there's such a big competition for spots in the decks at the moment. There's so much value to be getting for new clones. Like within the last year, we've seen Flesh Duplicate and Mockingbird, for instance. It's just like there's so much value to be getting from other cards that running a 1/1 flyer with an activated ability that dies to a Orcish Bowmaster is just like, I don't think so. So it's not like I don't think that Siren Storm Tamer isn't a good card for what it does. I just don't think it's good enough.
Yeah, I think that's my takeaway.
Yeah, and I'm also like, I've been in games where a graveyard hate has almost put me out of the game if it didn't do so. And it's just like, this feels so awful. But thinking back, I can't remember if it's happened more than 5 times over the last couple of years where it really set me back. Usually when people are exiling a graveyard, it's fitting in with their tempo of the game, meaning that if they have a Bajuka Bot and they need a land drop for the turn, you see people play them turn 1. Yeah. And I know that's the flexibility of a Bajuka Bot, that you have a tool and a land, and you can kind of disregard one of them if you need to. But it's also like having graveyard hate at the most opportune moments for your opponents is not what is going to happen most of the time.
No.
So if that's not the case, do you then really need to protect something that is not really in danger?
And for me, it falls into like, I rather want my deck to have more synergy and trim some of the fat that doesn't like make my plan go faster. And the other side of the coin, like the graveyard haze is also so. The problem is the graveyard deck, there's both enchantment that does it, and artifacts that does it, and lands that does it, and creatures that does it. So it's kind of hard to like point out what to do about it.
Yeah. I think the best card for Bracket 4 table, to be honest, is Stifle, because it hits so many important triggers in our part. But we are back to, is Stifle good enough? Because wouldn't you rather just run something that removes it or counters it to begin with, or anything like that? And then there's the whole, like you said, but what if you put in more cards that just help you win faster? If you win a turn earlier than you could have if you're running Graveyard Protection, would you then need the so-said Graveyard Protection if you're winning a turn early?
Yeah.
So that's game theory, and that's something that is very hard to answer, but it's not a simple answer.
And then there is like endurance and enhanced surveillance or stuff like that shuffles your graveyard back in. It sounds good on paper, but problem is you're kind of kneecapping yourself as well, because your graveyard is gone, not gone permanently, but it's gone, and you have to like restart the whole plan. So those kind of effects, I think they need to cost like 0 mana to be worth it. And even at 0 mana, I'm like, is this what you want to do? Again, probably winning before is better.
Well, endurance is 0 mana.
Yeah.
And also it has the flexibility of doing it to an opponent. So if he has the Wincon in the graveyard, it's an extra tool in your bag. So and I was also very fond of Turn the Earth, to be honest, because you could self-mill it and then you could still play it from the graveyard, which I actually loved. And it was not all of your cards, it was just key pieces that you could save, which I really liked. But yeah, I played most of them, those you talked about, and Perpetual Timepiece, because it also come with a mill activation. And there's also the new one that I'm actually running in Emery, Louisoix Sacrifice, where you can counter target activated ability, triggered ability, or non-creature spell. And specific to Emery is that I can sacrifice Emery and cast it for just 1 blue mana. And in most cases, I won't be sad to sacrificing Emery, so that's kind of within the game plan. And it also does counter a non-creature spell. So I think that's one of the better options at the moment. And I do hope that we will see more flexible cards like Louisoix Sacrifice that can save you from getting your graveyard exiled.
Yeah, I think they need to print something like Turn the Earth that you can flashback for 0 mana. Maybe it has some other costs, exiling cards from your graveyard or something like that, but I think that's where it needs to go to be worth it.
Anyway, that was all we had for you for this episode. We have 1 episode left in this Graveyard series. In the next episode, we will be talking about which commanders we think are the strongest. We will do an old-fashioned tier list of the graveyard commanders that we see in our part and the graveyard commanders we think are more relevant. Also, if you have any special graveyard shenanigans that you want to share with us, do so in the comments. You're also more than welcome to join our Discord community, ask questions, and share all your stories. But until next time, thank you for tuning in.
Thanks for watching.